Hi, my name's David McCulloch and I'm going to talk to you about my experiences as a novice surveyor of dragonflies at Flanders Moss National Nature Reserve. Occasionally you'll find a dragonfly perched on the entrance sign of the reserve, such as this female common hawker. Flanders Moss is located in the heart of Scotland's Central Belt. It's about 30 miles north of Glasgow and 10 miles west of Stirling and the M9 motorway. So if anyone from south of the border is listening to this, the Moss is actually a very easy place to visit if you want to break a long car journey up to the Highlands. The National Nature Reserve is managed by NatureScot, known until last year as Scottish Natural Heritage. The peat formed 8,000 years ago and it sits on top of post-glacial clay. The peat dome is up to 7 metres deep in places and it forms incredibly slowly, just 1 millimetre per year. As a raised bog, it is kept wet entirely by rainfall, and we certainly have plenty of that. It is in fact one of the most intact raised bogs in Europe. It used to be more extensive, but 860 hectares remain after the agricultural improvements of 1750 to around 1860. The landowners in those days wanted to get rid of the peat to reach the fertile clay that lay beneath. So they cut the peat away and they washed it down the River Forth. Unfortunately, in the 20th century, there were further attempts to drain part of the bog in advance of removing even more peat. However, fortunately, NatureScot's predecessor stepped in and bought out the peat cutting rights. A huge amount of work's been undertaken to restore the bog. For example, a large plantation of conifers was removed, and ditches have been dammed to raise the water table back to previous levels. This work has in fact been so successful that the boardwalk has had to be raised several times to stop it flooding. Importantly for us though, it is a dragonfly hotspot. This satellite view shows the peat bog very clearly, even without me adding an artificial border around it. You can see the patchwork of fields around the outside of the bog, much of which would have been created by stripping away the overlying peat. If you've ever visited the site, it might be surprising how extensive the bog is compared to the size of the boardwalk. However, please be aware that due to previous attempts to drain the bog, there are many very deep ditches and visitors really do need to stay on the boardwalk. As a way of explaining how I got into surveying, it might be useful if I talk a little bit about my background. I've got no formal experience or qualifications in nature conservation, simply an amateur interest in the outdoors and nature, like many of us I'm sure. I started volunteering with Scottish Natural Heritage in late 2015, helping with various conservation tasks. I bought my first digital SLR camera in 2017, after years of taking photographs on my phone badly. In 2018, I started photographing wildlife, and I quickly realised that dragonflies made great subjects. That four-spotted chaser photo is in fact the very first dragonfly I ever photographed. However, in 2018 I couldn't have told you the difference between dragonflies and damselflies, or I couldn't have named any species. I was a complete beginner. I learnt through photography because once I photograph something, I need to learn what it is. The book on Britain's dragonflies was my main reference point when I got home with any new photographs that I had to identify. And then in response to one of my tweets, Danielle rather cleverly and casually mentioned that BDS is looking for someone to carry out surveys at Flanders Moss, and I started in July 2019. The main challenge I've faced is that I'm red-green colourblind. Small, fast-moving creatures are a particular problem, but there are ways to minimise those problems. For a start, there are only 11 species of Odonata at Flanders Moss, and that might explain why I chose to survey for dragonflies as opposed to any other insect groups. Although I was initially a bit sceptical, I've found that close focusing binoculars really do help because my eyes need the largest possible surface area to have any chance of identifying the colour. I rely heavily on other methods, of course, such as looking at the patterns, size, the habit. And differing flight periods also help. Large red and female emerald damselflies can actually look very similar to me at a distance, but they peak at different times. But I do need to be careful not to make assumptions that just because I've seen something at a particular date that means it must be a particular species. The main message of this talk really is that if a novice who is colourblind can survey for dragonflies, then anyone can. So if any of you listening to this are been a bit wary of taking the plunge and doing some surveys, why not just give it a go? Another challenge I've faced is obviously maybe particularly a problem in Scotland, but the weather. It needs to be sunny, calm and dry. I went to Flanders Moss many times last summer and found it was just too breezy or too overcast compared to the forecast. Nothing much was flying, and rather than record possibly misleading results, I just left the survey for a better day. My transect is limited to a rather nice slow walk around the boardwalk. It takes about 35 minutes, excluding travelling. I found the iRecord app of maybe limited use, as it uses bands, for example 2 to 5, to record the numbers that have been found, rather than the exact numbers. You could of course put that in the text box, but I just think for a formal survey it seems to me better to use the website. So I simply record my surveys in an old-fashioned notebook and enter them in the iRecord website later that evening. I found it's quite easy to use once you master the slightly fiddly technique of selecting your survey square on the map. Anyway, so much for the talking. Let's have a look at some photographs. So I'm going to show you all the species that I've seen on surveys at Flanders, with a note of the maximum number I've recorded of each species. And obviously this is going to be in reverse order. The most unusual dragonfly that we find at Flanders Moss is the northern emerald. Flanders is in fact at the southern end of its range in Scotland. Unfortunately, I've yet to see one in a survey, or indeed at all. They're mostly found on the western edge of the moss, but I got a rather excited email from the reserve manager last year after he found a pair of northern emeralds not far from the public car park. However, as I could never find them, I had to rely on his photographs. You can probably sense the weariness in my voice. However, hopefully I'll be luckier in 2021. Blue-tailed damselflies are present only in small numbers. I've only seen the maximum of 2 on a survey. I've counted a maximum of 6 common hawkers in my surveys. The photo on the right was in fact just taken a few miles away, not at Flanders Moss itself, and amazingly that was actually the first common hawker recorded in Britain in 2020, on the 6th of June. I've seen a maximum of 7 common darters in my survey. The moss isn't just a hotspot for dragonflies, it's also got a good population of adders, and this common darter was actually perched on a birch log that was part of a man-made hibernaculum for adders. Next up we have the Azure damselfly. This one was actually found at RSPB Loch Lomond, and it has a rather unusual deformed abdomen. I've seen 9 Azure damselflies at Flanders in my surveys, but so far no common blues. Emerald damselflies become quite abundant later in the summer. It's always good to be able to photograph damsels in that rather distinctive love heart mating position. Now we've reached the top 3, and in third position we have the black darter with 34 recorded in one survey last year. They like to sit on the boardwalk and fly off just as you approach. In second place we have the four-spotted chaser with 39 recorded on the 1st of June last year. They're actually one of my favourite dragonflies because they like to perch and often fly off and return to the same perch, so they're actually quite easy to photograph. Notice the one in the centre, which is actually a 3-spotted chaser. Despite missing one wing, it seemed to be able to fly well enough though. And the most abundant Odonata species at Flanders is the large red damselfly, with 58 recorded in a survey last year. If you visit at the end of May or the start of June on a sunny, warm, calm day, you'll have absolutely no difficulty seeing them sitting on the boardwalk. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this short visit to the wonderful Flanders Moss. If you want to learn a bit more, I would strongly suggest you follow the blog Two Bogs, a Swamp and Some Islands. It covers Flanders Moss, Blawhorn Moss and the Loch Lomond National Nature Reserves. And if you live nearby, there are weekly conservation work groups on a Wednesday, COVID permitting of course. Tasks have included removal of non-native invasive species, ditch damming and maintenance of the wildflower meadow. And if you're interested, please contact the reserve manager. I've also added my own contact details in case you've got any queries about anything I've covered or indeed not covered in this talk. Thanks for listening.